by some GPs, the frustration of others who wanted to help her but knew they'd be hauled up in front of the General Medical Council if they did. Barbara told me that she is living half a life and she grieves for her past. She said she is missing out on so much, including time with her grandchildren, who, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can testify to the House are gorgeous little girls. Barbara, like thousands of others, wants and deserves to live in a country where the government properly funds research, where treatment helps and doesn't hinder, where support from the state doesn't come at the cost of dignity, and where people actually listen to her. Right now, this isn't the case. Barbara told me every single time she went for blood tests, which of course were the wrong ones, and they came back, she was actually hoping it was something like cancer, just so she could put a name to the intense pain that she was feeling, get the right treatment, and know whether or not she was going to live or die. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope for the sake of my constituent Barbara and the 250,000 others affected that the Minister is really listening today to what's being said and is ready to give some justice and some comfort to those voices who've been ignored for decades.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to be called to speak in this debate, and in particular to follow the member for South Shields and the comments she's made. I'd particularly like to thank the constituents who've got in contact with me ahead of the debate, encouraging me to attend, but also making clear their concerns about this issue. And I think what's been picked up already by a number of members, and it's a point I reflect on as well, is the impact this condition can have on someone's life, but also at the same time the battle they have to sometimes get it recognised that this is the issue that's affecting them. Of course, there is no specific test for this condition, and that also leads on to the fact that then there's no specific cure for this condition, which, as just touched on in the speech we've just heard, can lead to scepticism rather than support in the way that someone should be dealt with. But as has been said and already referred to by a number of other members, this is a condition that has an impact of £3.3 billion a year in terms of healthcare costs, with the welfare payments related, productivity losses, unpaid informal care, but also, of course, in the wider lost opportunity that those who suffer from this condition are not able to live life to the full or as they would wish to have done so. So therefore it will be interesting to hear from the Minister, particularly looking at the review of the NICE guidelines. And whilst it's welcome to see what is being looked at for reasons that other members have already gone into, it would particularly welcome news about whether we might be able to bring forward some updated guidelines earlier than the stated timeline of 2020. It would certainly be interesting to hear the Minister in his reply come up with that. And as has also been touched on already, it's actually quite remarkable when you consider the impact to see how little is being spent on research, but I think it's something like 0.02% of all active grants given by UK mainstream funding agencies going towards support research in this area. Clearly, without research, there is not going to be the hope of improved treatments. There's not going to be the hope of developing a test so that people can move away from scepticism to having support from their medical practitioners, and also ultimately in terms of hopefully finding a cure or a treatment that may at least mitigate some of the effects of this. As has already been touched on, there's clearly an issue in relation to those living with this condition into how assessments may be done for welfare benefits, particularly given there can be the issue of being assessed on what might be a good day, but then that not reflecting the overall condition of the person concerned. It's particularly interesting to hear the Minister, perhaps in his summing up, reflect on some of the conversations that the Department of Health are having with the DWP, although I accept, and by his indication, this is unlikely to be a particularly long period of time he will get to sum up, given the short length of this debate. But certainly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome the fact that we have had an opportunity to at least highlight this issue on the floor of the House. I do congratulate the honourable member for Glasgow North West and the other members who applied in securing this debate and ensuring on a cross-party basis we could put forward the concerns that we all have. And as was touched on, there's 250,000 people living with this condition here in the UK. It is one that needs research, it is one that needs support, and also one that actually a change of culture around it, so that those who are suffering with it feel they get the support, the belief and then a hope for a normal life that all of us have the right to expect and deserve.
I'm terribly sorry, but it's obvious that a lot of people wish to speak. We have very little time, and I'm sure that the House wishes the Minister to have time to answer the many important points that have been raised. Therefore, I have to reduce the time limit to 3 minutes. Mr. David Drew.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I shall try and be very brief. And I congratulate the Honourable Lady for calling this debate through the Backbench Committee. So I shall try not to go over the existing ground, but I will pay due regard to my constituent, Dr. Charles Shepherd, who continues to advise the Society and has come forward with many suggestions that they followed. In terms of the headings that have already been highlighted, but I wish just to touch on. In medical education, there is some evidence of progress here, which is very pleasing. GPs are, of course, the gatekeepers, and they need to recognise ME at an early stage so they can help their patients. It's very heart-rending to read what different constituents have written to me, particularly the parents of younger children who have their offspring suffering so dramatically from this dreadful condition. The PACE trial and the need for a nice guideline rewrite is already been touched on. It's so important they bring that forward. Research, it would be interesting to know why the government has cut the monies it's sending through the biomedical research, through the National Institute for Health Research. If that money could be put back in, I think that would be one bit of good news the Minister could give us today. Likewise, within the DWP, my honourable friend from West Bromwich has already touched on that. It's so important that this is recognised in terms of what those who suffer from it get early support. And likewise, in terms of the work of clinical commissioning groups, NHS has got to do more and got to recognise that this is an area that it has got to spend its own local resources on. But in the remaining minutes, I just want to concentrate on something that hasn't been touched on so far, which is the overlap with the B12 deficiency. Now, the autoimmune metaplastic atrophic gastritis, which was previously known as pernicious anemia, is often confused with ME, and I think it's very important that we encourage local health bodies to rewrite the rules for that condition as well, so we make sure that people are correctly diagnosed. It is so unhelpful when people's condition isn't properly recognised, and that means that we have this spiral downwards of their psychological problems, and it's about time that we spent the resource and did take this forward as a condition that needs so much help.
Stephen Kerr.
Deputy Speaker, I could just as easily say amen and sit down, but I'd like to particularly compliment the Honourable Member for Glasgow North West for her speech. I hope that this debate today, in the passionate interest of colleagues from across the House, brings some encouragement to those suffering from this condition. They are not forgotten. Louise McCallan from Riverside got in touch with me in June last year. She tells me that ME has led her to medically retire in her early 30s. She's been too sick to leave bed for months at a time. She's been able to tolerate light or sound. She's unable to meet her friends, and she suffers intolerable pain. She told me she was told by her neurologist in a major hospital there's no such thing as ME, and she was told when she got a diagnosis, at least you don't have anything serious. Catherine Smits from Stirling got in touch with me in May last year to tell me her story. For her, it's a dreadful illness that's left her signed off work for 22 years. She has balance and vision problems, sensitivity to light and noise. For her diagnosis, she was passed around hospital departments who could only look at their own specialist area. Cathy Dixon from Torbrex got in touch in November of 2017. Her case and the dangerous advice she was given saw her become more ill because of doctors who had no knowledge of ME. She continues to fight for the support she needs and deserves. And Pam Sullivan from Bridge of Allen also suffers from ME, which has left her with crippling fatigue, exhaustion, viral symptoms, muscle pain, impaired cognitive function, and without the support of her loving family, she would have no support at all. Now, I know the Minister is a compassionate and dedicated Minister, so I hope he'll respond to the demands that we are hearing today in this debate, that treatments which are harming patients should be discontinued with immediate effect. Does the Minister appreciate that ME patients cannot wait for NICE guidelines to be reviewed? I very much hope that he will agree it's simply not acceptable that seriously ill people should be left feeling that they are somehow to blame for not getting better, that it's only if they had a better attitude or a different mindset that they would recover. What more is going to be done to provide updated professional training to GPs and other healthcare professionals to properly recognise the symptoms of ME? And what more can the DWP be doing to see that ME patients are treated fairly and that the process they're subject to doesn't worsen their illnesses, especially in respect to how assessments are being conducted? And can the Minister please reassure the House that substantially more resources will be dedicated to biomedical research so that we can understand ME and begin to reach for solutions? Minister, people need help.
Calvin Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker. First, can I add my support to the motion as set out in the order paper and congratulate the honourable member for Glasgow North West in leading the way in securing this debate and also in her excellent speech, of course. I spoke in the previous Westminster Hall debate and later put down written questions on ME on a basis suggested by Dr Ian Gibson, whom longer-standing members may remember as a Labour member for Norwich and a distinguished medical scientist in his own right. Ian was incensed by the use of GET, graded exercise therapy, as less than useless and actually damaging to sufferers, as well as causing them pain and raising false optimism that such therapies would work. Given that ME causes extreme fatigue, suggesting more exercise seemed to me about as sensible as asking frostbite sufferers to walk about in the snow. The other suggested treatment of cognitive behaviour therapy helped to underpin the myth that ME is a psychological problem, not a physical condition. Neither of those supposed therapies should have been given credence. An effort should have been focused long ago to discover the real causes of ME and undertaking proper and thorough research to develop effective treatments. I first became aware of ME over 25 years ago when two of my young relatives were found to be suffering from the condition. The fact that I was not aware of ME until then is itself extraordinary, given that some 25,000 children are estimated to be suffering from ME. That is more than 38 children on average for every one of our constituencies. I later became informed of sufferers in my own constituency and recall one man in particular who suffered constant pain and had to lie in a darkened room because he could not bear the light. Such symptoms are not well known, but of course, like so many illnesses, the severity of symptoms can vary greatly. MS, for example, can advance rapidly or can remain fairly mild and stable for many years. Such variations do not, however, invalidate a condition. I have mentioned before children with ME, but if all adults are included, the figure reaches 250,000, or nearly 400 per constituency. It really is that serious. The impact on those constituencies' lives is enormous, but the cost to society, as we've heard, and to the economy, are over £3.3 billion a year, an enormous sum. So finding causes and discovering effective treatments is vital, and funding the research must be a priority. First, to reduce the level of suffering, but also to reduce the wider social and economic costs. But research into ME represents just 0.02% of all grants given to funding agencies. That is just 1/500th of the total, a pathetic amount. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I say that I hope we are now putting behind us all the myths and misdiagnoses about ME. It is a physical condition which has caused and is causing untold suffering. Recent research has looked very promising and points to possible causes of ME. One factor in particular has received recent publicity, the overactive immune system in many sufferers. We are starting to move in the right direction, it would seem, and we must congratulate those scientific and medical researchers who have done and are doing so much valuable work towards solutions to the scourge of ME and alleviating the suffering of causes. I hope in conclusion the Ministers will and other honourable members will take note of, in particular, of the reports in Breakthrough, the Journal of ME Research.
Very much. Mr Stephen Pound.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I say, North West London salutes North West Glasgow in this, and I was honoured and proud, not that I had much choice in the matter, to actually come along and support the Honourable Lady in the application. I have to say that her influence clearly spreads further than White Inch, when you consider it was only last week that the Scottish Government launched its National Action Plan on Neurological Conditions. And although the Action for ME have not been particularly delighted with that, one of the good things that came out of it was the allocation of, I think, about £90,000 for a PhD study on the impact of ME. If that was proportionate, Madam Deputy Speaker, to this country, it would be well over £1 million. And I think that's something we can certainly look forward to. We've talked about the individual characteristics and the individual circumstances of many of our constituents. I'd just like to mention one area that hasn't so far been brought forward, and that is the impact on housing, the provision and allocation of social housing. Because people with ME, people with chronic fatigue syndrome, as well as myalgic encephalomyelitis, often have very specific housing needs. I think of my constituent, Pamela Baden, who's admirably represented by her councillor, Councillor Deirdre Costigan, who finds it intensely difficult to live where she is at the present time because of her condition. The thing about ME, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that even if you sleep all night, you're still exhausted. Yeah. The point is the exhaustion is endemic. It is not something that can be satisfied or slaked by sleep. It is that terrifying a condition. And I have to say that if there's one thing that we can do today, and I am not going to go into the details of the research, I think the biomedical research we have to have, we've moved a little bit further forward from the dark days of, stiff upper lip and take, one full turn and 2 half hitches and pull yourself together. I think we've gone a little bit further forward from that. What we're talking about is we have to change attitude. You cannot dictate an attitude. We haven't had a dictator in this country since Oliver Cromwell. You cannot say what a people will do. What you can do is to raise this issue calmly, objectively, and using all the pragmatic skills that are available to us, and to actually use the data that's available. And I'd like to say to all those people out there suffering from ME, all those people who suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome, all those people who've been ignored and belittled and insulted in many cases, this House recognises the reality of your condition. This House will not sit idly by while you suffer. This House will not ignore you. This House will devote its intelligence and its resources to research, ultimately to resolve and to cure this terrible condition, because we respect you, we understand you, and we give credit and credibility to what so many people have for far too long denied. ME sufferers the world over must know that this House and this nation is finally speaking for you.
Karen Lee.
Speaker, I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Glasgow North West for securing this important debate. Follow that. Last year I was invited by a group of ME patients living in Lincoln to a screening of Unrest, Jennifer Breer's deeply moving and personally moving documentary. The film really opened my eyes to the bravery and resilience that people living with ME display on a daily basis. Over the last week, many of my constituents have contacted my office to encourage me to attend this debate. Hearing first-hand from people in Lincoln about the complex difficulties that people with ME encounter really underlined to me the need for more support to be provided at a national and a local level. Because ME is a disease which poses unique difficulties to those who suffer from it. We're all aware of its fluctuating and sometimes invisible symptoms, which have fuelled an unjust and debilitating stigma around the disease. And this stigma is institutionalised into the fabric of ME medical research, healthcare provision and our welfare system. When it comes to treatment, people don't have access to adequate care and support, and there's almost a total lack of appropriate secondary services. Yeah. Many primary care professionals receive minimal training on ME, and I can speak about this personally. I didn't get a lot as a nurse, and are therefore occasionally prone to holding stigmatised, misinformed opinions about the illness. Very true. And it's clear that more training is required, not only for healthcare professionals, but also for welfare assessors. Welfare assessors frequently don't have enough sufficient understanding of ME, and therefore often fail to accurately assess claimants. I heard this a lot when I went to that film screening. It's completely unacceptable that people suffering from ME are, through no fault of their own, even more harshly exposed to the cruelties of Tory welfare cuts and a disastrous rollout of universal credit. This government must consider properly funding research into ME to better understand the condition. And it's crucial that we all work towards eradicating the stigma of ME and improve routes to diagnosis, care and treatment. It's also crucial that all members across this House recognise that can only be achieved with adequate resources. And I hope today that the Minister will give us a real commitment to do this and not just give us warm but empty words.
Ben Lake.
Deputy Speaker. I'd also like to join with others in congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow North West, not only in securing this important debate this afternoon, but also for her tireless work with others to raise awareness of the difficulties that individuals with ME endure, for relentlessly challenging authorities to improve on the way in which they support sufferers, and for giving voice to those who all too often feel abandoned and alone. Now, as we know, ME is a chronic multi-system disease that impacts approximately 250,000 people across the UK. Now, to put that number into context, ME affects more people than the terrible Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis combined. And it is estimated, as already been mentioned this afternoon, it has an economic cost of £3.3 billion. Now, one would imagine that these considerations alone are sufficient to ensure adequate funding for biomedical research into ME and clinical care for those suffering from the disease. And yet, ME research represents just 0.02% of all active grants given by UK mainstream funding agencies. It really does beg a belief that research into an affliction that leaves a quarter of sufferers house or bedbound, and from which 95% of people do not recover, receive so little funding. This underinvestment needs to be addressed urgently, and I hope that the Government Minister can help in this regard. I also support the review of the NICE guidelines on the treatments prescribed for ME and do hope that it can be implemented as soon as possible. If positive changes are adopted, I obviously, of course, hope that they are in turn implemented by the Welsh Government so that ME sufferers in Wales can also benefit. Now, I know the time is against me, so I'll conclude by saying that it is near impossible for those of us fortunate enough not to suffer from ME to truly comprehend its real, its tangible impact. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to conclude in the words of two individuals who have contacted me to share their experiences of the disease. John Peters suffers from ME and was first struck down in the 1980s. The impact on his life has been total. As he so painfully put it to me, quote, "I have missed the whole spectrum of life. The big things such as family, a career, holiday celebrations, the hooks of someone's years, but also the minor events. The night out with a friend, the moment on a mountain, the lazy morning in bed with someone, that fantastic book, The Sharing of a Joke," end quote. And then Saran, a teenager from Ceredigion who suffered from ME for over a decade and is now mostly housebound after receiving a formal diagnosis last year. She told me, "I have no idea what a life without chronic pain is. I don't know what it's like to be able to tolerate noisy, bright spaces, what it's like to remember the conversations I've had with those I love. I have slowly watched my life disappear over many years, and now I'm entirely dependent on my parents. I have no job, no A-levels or hope for the future." Madam Deputy Speaker, I sincerely hope that this debate succeeds in its objectives, for we simply cannot wait any longer. John and Saran deserve some hope for the future.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also take this opportunity to thank the many constituents who have contacted me about their experiences, asking me to take part in this debate, and in particular to thank Pauline Donaldson of the Tyne and Wear ME CFS support group, who plays a really important part in making sure that I and other members from Tyne and Wear are aware of the very real problems faced by people who have this debilitating condition. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's 6 months since we last debated this issue in Westminster Hall. That's 6 months more that people with ME have been waiting to see real progress on finding effective biomedical research into ME to work towards finding effective treatments for their condition. 6 months more to suffer from the effects of ME, and, Madam Deputy Speaker, they are weary and impatient and angry that treatments like CBT and graded exercise, psychological treatments, are still being put forward as the most common treatment for what is a physical condition. I'm glad to take this opportunity to speak on their behalf. And what they're looking for is 4 things. Firstly, funding for biomedical research. I was shocked to hear that patients and families are helping to fund research themselves, and I think it's really important that we find the opportunity to have that biomedical research done through public funds. CBT and graded exercise therapy treatments. As we've heard, many people with ME and their supporters have demanded that the use of CBT and graded exercise therapy should be stopped. And I want to talk about one of my constituents shortly and explain his experience with that. Training of GPs. They want to see more training for GPs to recognise the signs and the symptoms. They invest in ME research, are doing much themselves and have information packs. They don't have the funds to extend that medical training everywhere. And for families and children with ME, as we've heard, one of the things can be that they can be subject to child protection procedures. I just want to say a bit before I finish about Angus, who is one of my constituents. He was a senior lecturer in business in a North East university. In 2012, every aspect of my life changed, he said, when I was struck down with ME aged 47. And he lost his job. He was never a couch potato, he says. In fact, just the opposite. And still loves these disputes, but can no longer do any of them. Climbing the stairs in the house seems more exhausting than any mountain I climbed in the past, he said. And he undertook the CBT and graded exercise therapy and found it made him not better, but so much worse that it was actually a relapse. I wish I had the time to read his own evidence. So it's really crucial that we address this problem and give these constituents with ME the treatment they deserve.
Nick Thomas Simmons. Oh, I beg your pardon. We've got to take the time limit down to 2 minutes or else everyone won't get a chance. Nick Thomas Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I also pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for Glasgow North West. The Welsh Association of ME and CFS Support confirms that 12,600 families in Wales are affected, and yet even with those numbers, awareness is crucial. Awareness in society generally, and awareness too at the Department of Work and Pensions for fluctuating conditions such as these. It's also true that ME receives far less funding than neurological conditions of similar prevalence, and that must change, and it must also be appropriately targeted. If the World Health Organisation classifies ME as a neurological condition, then clearly investment in biomedical research is required, whereas thus far it's been concentrated on psychological and behavioural studies. I'd also like to pay tribute in the short time I have to, in particular, 2 constituents who contacted me. First to Sarah Oakwell, who spoke very movingly about her symptoms, but also of the need to develop new initiatives and additional forms of individualised treatment. She spoke of new therapeutic strategies and also multi-centre interventions given the fluctuating nature of the condition. She spoke of more government-funded research and said this: "We will wait as we do now in the hope that today will be the day you listen, take note and do something to help." I'd also like to pay tribute to my constituent Reg Han, who contacted me about his grandson and said this very movingly: "I have had a close relationship with him all my life. Now he is too ill to travel to visit me, too ill to speak on the phone. He is 18 at the beginning of February and will be unable to celebrate such an important birthday. I will be 95 the week after. My best present would be if he is well enough to visit me." Now, what Reg needs, what Sarah needs, is action. I hope that they will get the action that they deserve.
Liz McInnes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Glasgow North West for securing this very important debate. And I spoke in the debate last year about Merrin Crofts, who is one of just 2 people in the UK who have had myalgic encephalomyelitis recorded as a cause of death. And Merrin was my constituent and lived in Norden in the Rochdale area of my Hayward and Middleton constituency. Merrin suffered so badly from pain that she could not get out of bed. Her GP had worked in a hospice for 10 years looking after cancer patients and said that in that job she could not always take away pain, but she could manage it. In Merrin's case, the GP said that her pain was unmanageable. And although Merrin was on diamorphine and ketamine, she was still in pain. Any kind of stimulus, even just a nurse walking into the room, was an exertion to Merrin. And Merrin's mother was very critical of the PACE guidance given by NICE and attributes the worsening of Merrin's condition to it. She tells me that Merrin thought she could push through the condition and keep going, although her family really wanted her to slow down. And sadly, it was only when the family contacted a private medical practitioner that Merrin was given the advice to slow down and told that she needed to rest. The specific advice given was whatever you feel you can do, only do 50% of it. And Merrin's mother feels very strongly that had Merrin been given that advice when her condition started, she might not have gone on to develop severe ME, and she strongly urges that the NICE guidelines should be reviewed. And Merrin's mother said to me, if the PACE trial were a drug, it would have been banned by now. I've also been contacted by other constituents who have urged me to take part in this debate. One of those is Rebecca Pritchard, who points out that it would not be difficult to increase funding for research, given that very little funding for ME has been given so far. And she highlights the work done by Invest in ME Research, based in Norwich, and points out the huge amount of funds that have been crowdfunded by patients and their families.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've got a very short amount of time, but I just hope that this debate will raise awareness of this condition. It's still an illness about which people very often don't really know much about, despite the fact that 250,000 people in the UK are affected by it, with around 20,000 of those living in Scotland. Despite all this, there is still no effective treatments for this life-changing, this life-stealing and cruel condition. What we need, Madam Deputy Speaker, is our frontline GPs to have proper training so they feel better equipped and more confident in diagnosis and treatment of this condition. And while recent investment by the Scottish Government is very welcome, it's nothing more than a start for this very, very long neglected and misunderstood condition. And I'm keen to hear what action the UK Government will take to increase awareness and understanding of this condition, and to help us understand the causes of the illness, so that by that route we can improve treatment and diagnosis of it. There's no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, having listened to the speeches across the House today, we need a concerted effort right across the United Kingdom to tackle this illness, and I'm very much looking forward to hear the response from the Minister. And before I sit down, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to extend my thanks to my honourable friend in Glasgow North West for bringing this debate forward, and for all the work that she has invested in bringing this to the House and raising the members of this House's awareness of it in the first place.
Darren Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the very short period of time today, I won't be able to give Karen, Caroline, Natalie, Anna, Emma, or many other of my constituents the justice of telling their stories today. But like my honourable friend, Member for Ealing North, said, to my constituents and to all of those watching, the House has heard you and understands your plight and your stories, and the will of the House today will make that very clear to the government benches too. What is clear from the stories we've heard today is what a devastating and complex disease this is. When I was a young human bioscience undergraduate, Madam Deputy Speaker, studying immunology, I heard this referred to in the labs as multiple excuses, and that wasn't that long ago. And so there is clear evidence that much more work is needed on the biomedical and the biological processes behind this complex and devastating disease. As a member of the Science and Technology Select Committee, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've recently completed an inquiry into research integrity, and we had some concerns around reporting and transparency, especially in clinical trials. And this goes to the concerns that many sufferers of ME have in terms of what research is being done and how the research is being done. And I hope the Minister might take an opportunity today to say what he might do further to our inquiry on the Select Committee to provide that transparency in prospective registration, but also dealing with positive bias in journals where researchers are incentivised to find positive answers as opposed to proving negatives. And actually proving negatives is sometimes just important, and how we could maybe change the culture of that environment. And lastly, in terms of the delivery of care, which we've heard from many honourable members today, we must have the research recognised in the NICE guidelines that lead through to the delivery of care to many sufferers, whether they be children or adults, in some of these heartbreaking situations. And in my final 10 seconds, Madam Deputy Speaker, may I pay tribute to the honourable member for Glasgow North West, my colleague on the Science and Technology Select Committee. I was pleased to support her application for this debate today, and I hope the government will respond with the significance that it needs to.
Mohammed Yazid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the member for Glasgow North West for tabling this very important debate. I have received a number of requests from my constituents asking me to attend this debate to highlight the devastating condition. Sufferers of ME are often stigmatised and marginalised as their conditions are not fully recognised by the government or the medical profession. A number of my constituents suffer from ME. At least 2 have been bedridden for 30 years because of their condition. Their story is not uncommon. 250,000 people suffer from ME, with 25% of individuals house or bed-bound. Children as young as 5 can develop the condition. It is the most common cause of long-term school sickness absences. A Westminster Court debate in February last year raised issues of the PACE trial that has influenced NHS treatment of ME. The report recommended that CBT and GET are effective treatments. More recently, research has disproved this study, which shows that CBT is not effective and GET can worsen individual symptoms, as is the case with some of my constituents. However, these are the only available treatments available on the NHS, meaning individuals and their families must endure treatments that not only fails to improve but can worsen their conditions. I therefore support the debate in favour of suspending current CBT and GET treatments in the NHS. I also support updated training for GPs and medical professionals to alleviate to unnecessary hardship individuals with ME and are currently subject to. ME has been overlooked for too long. We must find and support research properly and work to ensure that those that suffer from ME are listened to, diagnosed and treated in the best possible way.
Jim Shannon. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, can I congratulate the Honourable Lady for Glasgow North West on bringing this forward. She has been a champion for those who suffer from ME, and we thank her for all her efforts, and we're here to support her. I've also had the pleasure of meeting with a lady in my constituency who is attempting to cope with her illnesses, and at the same time, she also wants to champion and raise awareness on bringing change when it came to how we deal with those who are suffering from ME. And when I say suffering, the lady that I met, she certainly suffers. ME is an estimate to affect some 25,000 children in the UK. It's said to be the leading cause of long-term school sickness absence in the UK. And given the stigma people with ME face, families will continue to meet accusations of misconduct and upholding of support. For Mr. I ask this question: what's been done to help those 25,000 children? Secondly, there's an urgent need to update training of GPs and medical professionals so they are equipped with clear guidance and diagnosis of ME and appropriate management advice to reflect international consensus on best practice. In addition, all commissioning bodies must ensure medical, welfare and care services are accessible to people with ME, specifically including home visiting for those who are severely affected. The Honourable Lady in her introduction referred to, and I referred to it as well, the fact is that not much has changed. I still have ME constituents turned down for PIPs who are literally unable to leave the house 29 days of the month. I am seeing people removed from ESA and told they have to go to job interviews. And this is when they can't even manage to stand in a shower, or let alone leave the house or get a job. And it's well past time that we move past the idea that if it can't be tested, it won't be helped. This debilitating illness takes its toll on men, women and children throughout the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and we simply must do better by them. I would appreciate a response from the Minister as to the plans to do better. And if these plans are not in place, the question has to be asked: when will they be in place? The 400 ME sufferers in my constituency of Strangford asked for it, request for it, and indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, they demand it.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank those who, in my constituency, who have written to me to share their experience both as patients and parents. But I have a close friend myself who has battled this condition for 18 years, and I know that many sufferers find it dismissive to refer to it as chronic fatigue syndrome because it sounds so trivial. At the very least, it should be chronic exhaustion syndrome, because that's what it is, absolute exhaustion. And it affects 250,000 people, 10% of whom are children and young people. And 1/4 of those are so severe they are either housebound or bedbound. And the basic problem is we don't know the cause. It often seems to start post-viral, and I and maybe many others here have had post-viral syndrome that has often taken weeks or even months to get out of. But what is it about ME sufferers that makes it become long-term and chronic? And that's the crux of the thing. We need biomedical research to look at it, to see, is it an autoimmune cause? Is it a genetic weakness? Is it a neurological problem? Or is it metabolic? There is some interest in whether the mitochondria, the little power packs within the cells, are at fault. These things need to be looked at. And at the moment, the only real funding of research is by ME charities themselves. The UK hasn't funded any biomedical research since 2012. This then makes the diagnosis problematic. It's based only on symptoms. We don't have a test because we don't know the cause and we don't know what to test for. So naturally enough, I will stick up for doctors and say, that makes it kind of hard for doctors. It becomes a diagnosis of elimination. When they don't find the other obvious causes, it then is put down to ME. Following on from that is simply no treatment. There is no cure because we don't know the cause. There are no drugs coming down the pipeline, no procedures. And it means we are dependent purely on management and support. It has been raised that obviously CBT is not a cure and not a treatment. It may help some people cope with the depression and mental health issues that come from being so disabled, but it doesn't tackle the underlying ME. And as has been said, graded exercise actually can make things much worse. This is based, as has been said, on the flawed PACE trial published in The Lancet in 2011. And I think it's quite sinister that some of the funding for that trial was from the DWP and therefore added to this implication of malingering, despite the fact that 90% of sufferers were working before they were diagnosed and it drops to 35% afterwards. It was an unblinded study because you can't hide from people what treatment they're getting. That means all other aspects should have been very strict. And yet CBT and GET were promoted to patients as the thing that was going to help them. They didn't analyse their planned outcomes, which is critical in research. They lowered their defined targets simply because it was failing and used subjective rather than objective measures. Reanalysis of the PACE study has shown minimal benefit to these treatments. And indeed, as my honourable friend from Glasgow North West said, some people got worse and were still classified as a success. The only thing that has been shown to make a difference to some patients is what's called adaptive pacing. Listening to one's body, balancing activity with rest, planning one's day, one's weekend, activities with the family. The UK Centres for Disease Control and Prevention have removed these recommendations, but as has been said, there's still been nice recommendations since 2007. And although they're under review, and that will come out in 2020, too far away, if you look on their site, it still promotes CBT and GET. There should be a red warning saying, do not follow this, we are looking into it. And most of all, we need research to define the underlying cause and therefore to develop treatments for this condition. As well as the research funding that my colleague mentioned from the Scottish Government, they have given $300,000 to Action for ME to develop peer support projects. But research does need a bigger scale, considering the $3.3 billion economic impact. The US has moved to biomedical research, and as has been said, the UK is still totally focused on psychological. So in the meantime, till we have answers, the DWP need to recognise the impact and disability of ME. GPs, NHS staff and care staff need to provide support and emotional support to help manage the condition. And all of us need to recognise the impact of this condition and reduce the stigma that simply adds insult to injury.
Yeah. Sharon Hoss.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to start by thanking the honourable members for Glasgow North West and Cheltenham and the Right Honourable Member for Loughborough for securing this very important debate today. I would also like to thank all the honourable members who've spoken. It's been great to see so many speaking, and due to time I won't list them all. I also want to thank the charities ME Action, Action for ME, the ME Association, the ME Trust and ME North East, and all of the patients who've been in touch with me to share their thoughts, feelings and experiences of living with ME. The ME Association estimates that there is approximately 250,000 people in Britain affected by ME. And we've heard lots of those moving stories about those individuals today. However, an article published in the British Medical Journal in July 2018 reported that 90% of cases are thought to go undiagnosed and that people with ME are substantially undercounted, underdiagnosed and undertreated. Patients are often passed from pillar to post, as we've heard, with dismissals, misdiagnosis and sometimes left waiting over a year for a diagnosis. And I'm sure that the Minister does not need me to tell him that this doesn't meet NICE guidelines of diagnosis within 4 months of the onset of symptoms. The Government should therefore do more, and considering they're not doing much for patients with ME at the moment, I don't think that is too much to ask. The Government does not fund research and clinical care for people with ME at the rate of other serious prevalent diseases. As we've heard, the average research spent on a person living with ME is just £1 a year. And according to Action for ME, that represents just 0.02% of all active grants given by the UK mainstream funding agencies. So I'm concerned that the Government recently confirmed in a written answer a question that ME research funding is lower now than even it was in 2013-14. Current treatments of graded exercise therapy and cognitive behaviour therapy have been found to be harmful to patients with ME and continue the narrative of disbelief and neglect in patients that we've heard from a number of honourable members. NICE has already recognised that its current guidelines are outdated and that patients are not receiving the full picture on recommended treatments. NICE is updating its clinical guidance on the diagnosis and management of ME, but it's not expected to be published until October 2020. Patients and their families have already waited long enough. So will the Minister work with patients, charities, researchers and NICE to ensure that treatment and care for ME is appropriate? We have heard today why funding for biomedical research into ME is so desperately needed. According to ME Action, the only year that Medical Research Council invested any meaningful sum into biomedical research was in 2012, when £1.5 million of funds were ring-fenced. However, no funds have been allocated for biomedical ME research since then. In the Westminster Hall debate in June last year, I called on the Government to consider funding research because this is long overdue. So will the Minister commit to doing that today, or will the Government continue to leave it up to the charity sector to do so? Projects such as Invest in ME Research, who currently have 4 PhD students researching ME, have been financially supported via crowdfunding by patients and their families in excess of £870,000. Whilst this is fantastic, it shouldn't be left up to patients to crowdfund for research. More funding for research will enhance healthcare professionals and clinicians' understanding of ME, which will improve patients' experience and debunk the myths of ME, as we've heard today, being a primarily psychological condition. Clinicians must have access to up-to-date research and information so that they can give patients the best possible care and advice. But in some areas this is not the case, as Jennifer Elliott, the CEO of ME North East, has brought to my attention. Jennifer told me of the diminished services available for patients with ME in the North East region. There are no services at all for young people with ME in the entire North East. Adult services in Sunderland are closed to patients altogether and have been for some months, with no date for them to be reinstated. ME North East has been doing all they can to help and support ME patients for 20 years, but with a severe lack of funding, they are now at crisis point. I'm sure that other regions will have similar stories as we've heard today, so will the Minister please consider the loss of services in his response? Will he ensure that these services are reinstated and supported financially by the Government? Finally, we must ensure that the stigma of ME is tackled. Funding and research will help to do this. But it cannot be right that, as found last year, more than 1 in 5 families caring for a child with ME have been referred for child protection proceedings, as we've heard, due to school absences and just a lack of understanding by the school. I'm pleased that the vast majority of these accusations are dismissed in less than a year, but the added stress and burden to families with children suffering with ME can be overwhelming. We therefore, in closing, need more funding for research so we can understand, care for and treat ME and break down the stigma. Thank you.
Mr. Steve Brine.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was an impressive 2-minute limit to show what can be done in this chamber. Although I think it's unusual for ministers to make comment on this, Madam Deputy Speaker, but my plea to the Backbench Business Committee would be, I reckon sometimes to do less and to do it better, instead of trying to squeeze 2 really important debates into a very sports-focused time this afternoon. Maybe they will listen. Thank you to the members for my honourable friend from Southend West, from West Bromwich West, from Loughborough, from South Shields, from Torbay, from Stroud, from Stirling, Luton North, Ealing North, in usual style, Lincoln, Ceredigion, Bladen, Torfen, Hayward and Middleton, who I've heard that lady mention her constituent before, North Ayrshire and Arran, Bristol North West, who I thought gave the best speech, prize to him, and the gentleman from Bedford for their contributions, and of course the lady from Glasgow North West for her introducing the debate. I think I'm right in saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the 3rd debate the honourable lady from Glasgow has tabled on this subject and had granted in the last 12 months, so I applaud her dedication and her passion in ensuring that awareness of ME is kept very high, and I would echo the thanks that my shadow gave to all the charities working in this space, and welcome the Missing Millions ladies who I notice are up here in the gallery today. Thank you for coming and listening to our debate. I'm sorry it's been so rushed. As has been said, you know, we as a government do not for 1 minute underestimate ME. The truth is, as said by the lady from Central Ayrshire, we don't understand the underlying causes of it, and that there is no one diagnostic test to identify it, and although patients can improve and recover, and some do, but very few, there is currently no cure for it. And we know the condition has a devastating impact. We've heard some of those stories today. It's got a complex range of symptoms which for a physician are very, very difficult, and that includes disabling fatigue, that includes a flu-like malaise, that includes neurological problems, and then of course we've also heard about the effect on families and friends and carers and schools and housing. And nobody has mentioned, and I will mention it just very briefly in passing, the powerful film Unrest, which won an award at the Sundance Film Festival a couple of years ago, and that was a powerful presentation, if ever I saw one, of the impact that this condition can have on people's lives. I won't say any more on it, because last time somebody accused me of doing a film review on Unrest instead of responding to the debate, which I think was slightly harsh, but that's what social media does for you. And the honourable gentleman from Ceredigion, who is still in his place, I thought he put it very well, and although we give constituent stories in this place, we can't for 1 minute begin to understand what it must be like to suffer from this condition, and those who've seen the film can see how it literally just puts people flat on their back, sometimes for years. We've heard a lot today about the medical profession, and I have to say, the lady from Central Ayrshire touched on this. I think the medical profession have had a bad rap today, and some of it's deserved. But you know, as we've heard, and as I've said, the difficulties in diagnosis mean that patients with ME often experience great delays in getting the treatment and support they need. But in recognising the need for GPs to be aware of the condition, the Royal College of General Practitioners include ME as a key area of clinical knowledge that GPs should have as part of their qualifying exams, featuring it in the guidance for the applied knowledge test, a key part of those qualifying exams. The Royal College has also produced the online course for GPs on ME, and that highlights many of the common misconceptions that there are about the condition and considers the challenges that surround this very complex condition for primary care professionals. Nevertheless, it is true that once qualified, clinicians, Madam Deputy Speaker, they are responsible for ensuring their own clinical knowledge remains up to date. It's not the ministers to go on educating GPs. That is one of the reasons one of the jobs of the Royal College, and for identifying, so they're responsible for their ongoing learning. And, you know, I was clear in the last debate, and I'll be clear again, that activity should go on, and it should take into account new research and developments in the guidance, such as that produced and updated by NICE. And my honourable friend from Southend West said people feel fobbed off. They should never be fobbed off by the medical profession. And I would be very concerned to hear of that example. I'm not going to, because everyone's had their chance to speak and they wanted the Minister to respond. So I do think GPs have had quite a hard rap this afternoon, but what I can say is that I spoke to Helen Stokes-Lampard, who chairs the Royal College of GPs, before today's debate, and because I anticipated that this would happen, and I asked her whether she would be willing to come in here if I was to facilitate a round table, maybe by the all-party group, which I know we're hoping maybe will reinstigate, but certainly by the sponsors of today's debate, and she's very willing to do that. And I think that would be a very positive thing. So if the lady from Glasgow would like to be part of that, why don't we get in touch and make that happen? The door is going to be open. So to the NHS, the NICE guidance is very clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, on a number of important points. There's no one form of treatment to suit every patient, and it's self-evident. The needs and preference of patients absolutely should be taken into account. Doctors should explain that no single strategy will be successful for all patients, which is a hallmark of this condition. In common with people receiving any form of NHS care, ME patients have the absolute right to refuse or withdraw from any part of their treatment. Nobody is making this happen. And then fifth, those with severe symptoms may require access to a much wider range of support managed by a specialist. Now, NICE guidance supports commissioners to plan, fund and deliver ME services. And as we've heard in the debate today, and others tabled by the Honourable Lady from Glasgow, the use of CBT and GET in treating ME has long been a controversial issue for patient groups, for charities and some clinicians who are very divided on this condition. Understatement of the afternoon, perhaps. And this, of course, began with the publication of the NICE guidance in 2007 and continued with the PACE trial. However, as members clearly know from what I've heard this afternoon, NICE is updating the guidance and will examine the concerns about the PACE trial and whether there are implications for its current recommendations. Now, the updated guidance, as has been said, is due next year. Sadly, not until October next year, and until then, the existing guidance will remain current. So I will look into the point that the lady from Glasgow and others have raised about, you know, a request for an early statement from NICE. But what I would say is that, you know, NICE is an internationally respected independent organisation. If we didn't have NICE, we'd have to invent it. And the time that it was allotted to the development of the new guidance will allow all the evidence to be considered and all the voices to be heard, and I'm determined to make sure that happens. I want to touch on research, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I think every single speaker, and I've got a list here of them all and what they all said, I think every speaker mentioned research. So as I set out in previous debates, you know, the government invests £1.7 billion a year in health research via the NIHR and the MRC, the Medical Research Council, through the UK Research Innovation. So together, you know, they welcome high quality applications for research into all aspects of ME, which would absolutely include biomedical research. Now, the MRC has had a cross-board highlight notice on ME open since 2003, updated in 2011, inviting innovative research proposals alongside a bespoke funding call in that year. But ME research remains an area of very high strategic importance for the MRC. And what I would say is, I had no time to go into all the money that has been granted, but you know, one of the legacies of, and people have sort of asked me this afternoon, we must surely fund more research. It's not that ministers don't sit in the Department of Health and decide what to do research on. And one of the great legacies of the late Baroness Jowl was that she, in brain tumour research, understood that what needs to happen is we need to stimulate that research community to come forward with the best research proposals that then can be successful in bidding for funding. And the truth is, and sometimes it is a hard and inconvenient truth to hear, is that there have not been good enough research proposals brought forward in this space, partly because of the stigma, and I thought the lady from Lincoln raised that point and made that point very well. She looks delighted that I've I've quoted her, but she made the point well. And that is partly also because of the division within the medical community. But, you know, we need people to come forward with good research proposals in this space, and that can only be to the advantage. So I want to give the lady from Glasgow a chance to wrap up, but I want to thank her for raising the issue again on behalf of those affected, including many of my own constituents who've contacted me asking if I would be able to attend today's debate. So I was able to say, yeah, there's a fairly good chance I will pop in. And also, you know, one of the whips on the front bench here, the member for Bury St Edmunds, asked me to mention her constituent Rosalind Amor, who I know has been in touch with her many times on this subject. The government absolutely, Madam Deputy Speaker, recognises the strength of feeling on this issue, as it does with all those living with conditions and disorders where research is unable yet to help us fully understand. That's why we remain fully committed to delivering significant investment in our research programmes infrastructure, but we need people to come forward with those quality proposals. Thank you.
Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to give my thanks to all the honourable members who have stayed behind once again on a Thursday afternoon, particularly the members who sponsored the debate, especially the Right Honourable Member in the public gallery and the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate. We had some very clear asks that Minister has responded to in part. In terms of the medical research, I'm sure many researchers will have heard what the Minister has said, but it is notable that there is excellent research, biomedical research going on just now, but it has been funded by charity, not government. Government needs to take this seriously. But thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the country, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Thank you. A point of order, Karen Lee.
I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place. I thought the Minister was the final speaker. I did actually mention that film. I think Hansard will bear me out, the Unrest film. My constituents would never forgive me if I didn't point that out.
I appreciate that the Honourable Lady clearly appreciates that that is not a point of order, but she has corrected the record, and as she said, Hansard will, I'm sure, bear her out. Just before we adjourn the House, I'm afraid that I have once again to inform the House of a further correction to the number of votes of members for English constituencies in the division on Lord's Amendment 36 to the Tenant Fees Bill yesterday. There was a technical hitch at that time. The figures were announced as the ayes 261, noes 194. The figures should have been announced as ayes 263, noes 194. The result is unaffected. But the record has been put straight.
I beg to move this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Chion
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I must start by declaring an interest. I am a